Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Apocalypse Now panel discussion. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our wonderful panelists who will introduce themselves in a moment. And thank you to all of our attendees who are joining us for this conversation. So the Apocalypse Now program is happening in companionship with our current art exhibition here at the Johnson County Arts and Heritage Center. It is the Resilience, Reflection, Rebuilding, Artists Respond to COVID-19 exhibition, which is on view through January 22nd. This exhibition features approximately 65 artists with over 55 works of art, which are all in response to the current COVID-19 pandemic and the way that these artists have coped since the start of all of this. This program is happening in partnership, along with the exhibition, in partnership with the Arts Council of Johnson County, the Johnson County Museum, and the Fine Arts Department of the Johnson County Park and Recreation District. So thank you to our partners. We are proudly supported by the Humanities Kansas program. We had funding generously provided by Humanities Kansas, which is a nonprofit cultural organization that connects communities with history, traditions, and ideas to strengthen civic life. Our audience members can participate in this panel discussion through the Q&A section. You will find this section down at the bottom of your screens where you can input a question as you see fit, and we will do our best to try to address it when appropriate. And if we do not get to it during the discussion, we will save some time to address those questions toward the end. This program is also being recorded for future distribution through our social media as well as the AHC website. So now I will go ahead and ask that our panelists introduce themselves and just share a little bit about their background and their connection to our concept. Craig, we will start with you.
Good evening. First of all, I'd like to thank you for having me. I'm very excited with this topic. My name is Craig Workman, and I'm a professor of English at Johnson County Community College. And among other things, one of my areas of expertise is dystopian literature and film. And I suspect that's why I'm here.
Hey everyone, my name is Camille Kulig. Thrilled to be joining everyone this evening. I currently work in learning and education at the Arts Bridges Foundation in Bentonville, Arkansas, and I'm previously with the National World War I Museum and Memorial in education, and I have a background in art history, and you'll be hearing more about that this evening. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Thanks to the sponsors of this program. I'm looking forward to being part of this discussion. My name is Arzie Umali. I am an artist. I have my BFA in painting. I'm also the Senior Assistant Director of the UMKC Women's Center. At the Women's Center, I do all things feminist. And a couple of programs that I run there include the Her Art Project, which is a program I founded myself that supports women in the arts, as well as a healing arts program that I manage. I also have a background in multicultural arts. I'm the former program coordinator of the African American History and Culture House at UMKC, where I coordinated art exhibits that featured multicultural artists.
Hi everyone, good evening. My name is Smitha George, and I am one of the artists from Resilience, Rebuild, and Reflect show. I'm a full-time artist from Kansas City area. I work on different mediums and different subjects. I'll be talking more about the painting later on as it goes through. And I'm glad to be here among wonderful panelists, and thank you to everyone for joining tonight.
Thank you all. So again, I'll remind everyone that this discussion regarding our current state of the world and whether or not we are in an apocalypse is in direct companionship with our current exhibition at the Johnson County Arts and Heritage Center, Resilience, Reflection, Rebuilding, Artists Respond to COVID-19. And that exhibition is up through January 22nd. So we'll go ahead and dive in. Craig, can you set the stage for us? What is an apocalypse, and can you give us some well-known examples of what that might be?
Certainly. Well, I'd like to first talk a little bit about the sense of that term apocalypse, and then definitely go into both a few examples that we've seen in history, as well as some examples in literature and in film. So to begin with, my sense of it is that nowadays, and not just nowadays, but for quite some time, we've equated that term apocalypse with, well, to be honest, with hell. So, well, to quote Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, I believe it was 1651, he said of that sort of hell, that hell is truth seen too late, which we might argue in some ways we're soaking in that as we speak. What's more, in the Bible, the book of Revelation is, among other things, called the Apocalypse of John. So we see that term, the senses of it, as the pulling back of the veil, as that surprising thing that we're made aware of or put into, that's made known in a dramatic way. The notion of something that directly affects our human existence or our understanding of the world. So as far as examples in history, what we've seen, what I would consider pretty well-known examples would be 14th century Europe, the Black Death, depending on which figures you look at, up to 50% of everyone in Europe died during that. That would certainly qualify. The First World War, the Second World War, the Holocaust, which millions of Jews and gypsies and literati were exterminated. Certainly, let's see, the Dust Bowl of the 1930s during the Great Depression. And then moving on to talking about examples in literature or in film, Stephen King's The Stand, or the Dark Tower series, of course, based on Robert Browning's apocalyptic poem. George Miller's Mad Max universe, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. Cormac McCarthy's The Road. Matheson's I Am Legend. Octavia Butler's Parable series. Much work by Margaret Atwood. Ursula K. Le Guin, The Walking Dead, both the original graphic novels, all the iterations of it on television. And I could go on and on and on for hours talking about is certainly the examples that we see in popular culture today.
So with all of that in mind, do you feel, and I'll open this up to others as well, but I'll kind of start with Craig. Do you feel that the term apocalypse serves as a good descriptor for what we're currently experiencing?
I think the term apocalypse is apropos in many senses. But along this, and this will come as no surprise to any audience members who know me well, I would consider using the term dystopia to maybe be a little more of an apt term. And by that, I'm sure many of you have heard of that term. But that comes from the Greek base of dys, meaning bad, and topos, meaning place. Generally speaking, it's an antonym of utopia, which I'm sure pretty much everyone's heard of. The term dystopia was coined on or about 1868 by John Stuart Mill. So for example, in literature and in film or so-called filmic text, it's seen as a thought experiment. It's seen as that what if. And again, at least in what we read and what we discuss with my students in a classroom setting, it works as an allegory. And by that, I mean, it works as a commentary on, let's say, ethical concerns, on the political sphere, on feminism, on notions of reality, of life, of justice, things of that nature. And it tends to our contemporary world in so doing. In other words, we look at it as a what if, as now. So with regard as to our now, as in what we're all dealing with as we speak, our reality, then I think a dystopia, to use the term dystopia, is a fitting moniker because we're living out possibility in a negative case, yet I would argue still not the worst case scenario, which is often what much of the rest of the world deals with on a daily basis.
Absolutely. Would anyone else like to contribute? Camille, do you feel like the term apocalypse applies to what we're living through?
I think it will be interesting to see 5 years out, 10 years out, 50 years out, and always remembering when we're talking about history, that is a construction, and that's always evolving, right? How people experience it now is going to be markedly different how they feel about it, and then people who didn't live through it are going to talk about it. And that's certainly, Craig, when you brought up World War I is couldn't be a more apt example. So often we try to talk about the range of the devastation, the ways in which the war so greatly departed from previous wars that were fought, and certainly since. And there's often this gap that we have to contend with, that in all the ways we try to access that time, we didn't live through it. And so it is through the arts, which do provide that access to understanding what it would have been like. And so often you do have language that certainly you could attribute to being dystopian, to being apocalyptic, right? But certainly we're using those lenses from our own experiences, right? And we have an infinite amount of lenses too. So I always think it's helpful to think about time is always some kind of rupturing. There's always some kind of fracturing. That's always an evolution. And certainly right now, we could certainly attribute them to being some kind of break. And we won't know exactly how big that break is, how much that changes right now, but certainly there are some helpful conclusions that we can draw.
Absolutely. And we're hoping to kind of gain a better understanding of that through this conversation, which is really lovely. Arzie, would you like to add to that?
Well, you know, when I think about apocalypse, I think in more like dramatic terms and some of the like historical imagery, you know, that comes out of art history from Hieronymus Bosch and Albrecht Dürer and Michelangelo, even, where you see, you know, like what Craig said, kind of images of hell, like fire and flooding, and, you know, some of those more dramatic images of what we may see even in the movies that he mentioned. I like that he mentioned I Am Legend, because I always think of zombies when I think of the apocalypse. But, you know, and if you look at the metaphors now of what's going on in our country and around the world, actually, you know, fires in Australia, that was what my concern was last year in January, was the bush in January burning. And then you think about the fires in California all summer. And the natural disasters that are happening in all the hurricanes in the Atlantic that we experienced, and typhoons in the Pacific, and just even the worldwide death toll from the pandemic right now. And all of these are metaphors. You know, we've had almost 2 million people die from this pandemic, over 375 million in America, you know, alone. And these are just, you know, metaphors for what, you know, an apocalypse is. So yeah, I would, you know, say, yeah, we can say that we are in apocalyptic times.
Absolutely. Smitha?
Just adding to what everyone said, I think apocalypse has many other words, like you can say it calamity, disaster, tragedy. So there are many words to it. I think 2020 gave us lots of these synonyms from, let's say, as Arzie said, the wildfires raging in the West Coast, widespread protest. We cannot forget about that. A divisive election, like it was the major thing in 2020 as well, along with the pandemic which we were facing. News stories about murder hornet. I mean, these are the things which we were hearing throughout 2020. In this all, we saw uncertainty. And I think if we put our thoughts in a kind of mechanism to cope with change in a more positive way, rather than things like thinking like it is an apocalyptic era, we will be, I think, more prepared for the situation that is coming along, because it's going to change. It's no matter, it's just that we have to be prepared for it with a positive note.
Absolutely. I find it interesting that we had so many comparisons to visual arts and literature and components of history and everything in this almost fantastical sense. And yet here we are with everything that Smitha just described as these news articles that have come about. It's so surreal. It's so completely surreal what we're living through right now. So anyway, Camille, something about post-World War I era is very similar to kind of what we've been experiencing. What are some of the similarities between that era and what we're going through now?
I so appreciate this question because at the National World War I Museum Memorial, we always say that there are infinite amount of connections you can make between our world today and that of the World War I period. I think it's so often an impulse to put some distance between people of then or how people used to do things and now, and that can come for a host of reasons. But I think like when you're paying attention, there can be so many helpful points of connectivity. In saying that, and also holding that the technology we have today, information we have that we didn't used to also exists. So these both similarities and of course like differences, like any kind of comparisons, right? So holding those at the same time, I always try to think of that when I make those kind of comparisons. So the first one, which what I think is on top of mind for most folks, is the 1918 to 1919 influenza pandemic. This was accelerated through World War I. Often the hallmark when people talk about World War I, what they remember learning about it in school is the trenches, how war was fought through trench warfare on the Western Front as one example, and those trenches being really, really unsanitary. So that certainly accelerated that movement of. And you have multiple waves of this pandemic too. Health structure, the public health structure, wasn't in place in the way that it is now. So certainly a departure there. But you had mask wearing and people not wanting to wear masks at that time as well. You also had a significant population of young folks who became sick, who perished from. So certainly that affects the future generations. So there are ample amount of parallels you can make between then and now, and certainly it being a centennial amount of time between the two. You also have a presidential election in 1920, which was a really contentious one. And that one of the most famous phrases to come out of there is the return to normalcy, right? You have the United States on the tail end of the war that the armistice is called in 1918, but it takes a while for United States troops to return back to the US, and certainly fighting continues to happen over all parts of the world. So there's this real reckoning within the United States that occurs of what kind of nation do we want to be? We've entered this world stage, and this can be a point of great decision about how do we envision ourselves? What are our identities going to be? What do we value? And that's really reflected through the platforms in 1920. And we also have the passage of the 19th Amendment too, which we can certainly make some connections about voter restrictions during that time. So many organizations, including the Johnson County Museum, took part in that commemoration of the passage of the 19th Amendment, and thinking about how certainly that opens the enfranchisement of more folks than it used to. Part of what the amendment says is that you can't discriminate based upon sex, but as many of us know, that certainly did not bar all ways in which voting was restricted, was made more difficult, quite frankly, made impossible for many, many groups. And we continue to see the legacy of that throughout the 20th century and certainly into the 21st century as well. So those are really, really those kind of like flashback moments, those really great points of connectivity between World War I and now.
That's really interesting, thinking about the historical context and the ways that that's connected. So keeping that in mind, how did the artist's response in the post-World War I era shape cultural shifts?
I think art, and not only visual art, and I'm so interested to hear what the other panelists have to say about this, whether we're talking about music, we're talking about poetry, we're talking about theater, some of the novels to come out of World War I. It is through those in which we remember today, in which we interpret, and which gains us access to that period of time. And some of the most, I think, personally incredible works come from World War I specifically, that you had authors and artists who fought and served in World War I, or they had family members who served in World War I as well. And you have this great grappling, and this happens during World War I, and certainly the period after it as well. Some famous names that folks may be familiar with. We have Georgia O'Keeffe. Her brother served in World War I, and you have these really some thoughtful works to come out of there, these mediations upon war. You have Marsden Hartley as well, another artist not as well known, Horace Pippin. He's actually someone who served. And these are a bunch of names I brought up to tell us that there are a range of responses to come out of responses to the war. And it's fascinating because during World War I is often attributed to the rise of modern art, right? When work starts to become more abstracted, but certainly you're still going to have work that looks representational, right? That you'll see a human and it looks like a human as we'd understand it, but it's going to exist in the stew with a lot of other rise of different styles, different modes, different ways to communicate experiences. So World War I certainly accelerates that shift. That was happening before 1914. And it's fascinating. So when you oftentimes, if you look at an abstracted work, you can see that literal like fracturing on the canvas. So for example, you could see a perishing body, which would be a great example. And then I always like to liken that to that kind of fracturing and thinking that happens during the war and then after the war, that belief in the structures that used to exist, whether that be economic, whether that be social, whether that be political, those are so deeply unstable. What we used to believe about the world is no longer true. World War I was such that moment and continued to be that moment. So we see so much in the work that gets created during World War I and certainly after it, this ongoing reckoning. Art historians who talk about American art that is created during that time and after sometimes talk about kind of these hauntings that we see. That sometimes we see work from the 30s or the 40s, only then when artists begin to grapple with. And certainly this is interpreted through art historians, and certainly an artist can say this has nothing to do with. And certainly for a long time too, within scholarship on American art, there was this belief in, because Americans officially joined the war so late, there was a kind of indifference to, or there wasn't real response to, or art wasn't that concerned with or interested. And it's fascinating to see over the last few years, to coincide with the centennial of the war, you see this rise in scholarship interested in looking at it again, saying it was responding to, there is this interest, and sometimes we see that pushing away of, sometimes that leaning into as well. So it's just so fascinating the way in which I think art really opens up during this time, and that opening really didn't stop throughout the 20th century, and I think is certainly still continuing.
Absolutely. And that's actually a perfect segue to our next question. But before I dive into that, I do want to remind our audience that you guys are more than welcome to send us questions or comments throughout this discussion through the chat feature, which you can find along the bottom of your screen, or Q&A feature, I apologize. So speaking about artists and the response and everything, artists were in conversation in the post-World War I era, literally and through exhibitions and so much more. And because of this, a movement formed. in art, literature, music. Today, a lot of artists are currently creating in isolation. Arzie, do you think that there is a movement happening right now, even though those artists are isolated in this way that we are?
You know, it's hard to right now, while artists are currently working to really, you know, pinpoint what's going on, what the movement is, and give any kind of appellation to it. But I want to kind of go back to you know, kind of what Camille was talking about with artists who were kind of responding to what was going on. And I think one of the most interesting and powerful movements that came after World War I was Dada. And the Dada movement and the absurdity that these artists were seeing in art, kind of responding to like the horrors that they were seeing that they had experienced from World War I, and really questioning, you know, the elitism of art and its usefulness, and, you know, seeing art as kind of, before depicting the modernism and industrialization of the world, but then looking at, you know, what did this industrialization just do to the world? You know, we created guns and that killed people and caused all this destruction. So artists really responding to that and looking at Dada, creating the Dada movement as a way to maybe get away from that frivolity. And it kind of evolved into the, you know, surrealism and the surrealist movement. We also got the Bauhaus movement of art and architecture in Germany, where they really took a minimalist approach to design. And we see, you know, actually bathroom design came out, the way that we see bathrooms now, where they're all really sterile and sanitary and use like stainless steels and porcelain. That was done on purpose because of the pandemic and the 1918 flu. And so in order to keep bathrooms cleaner and to easily sanitize, they started designing bathrooms in a way that using materials that were more sanitary. And I think what we're seeing now is that, yeah, artists may not be together. We are all isolated and making art in isolation, but I think we're still finding ways to communicate. You know, it's a really difficult time for artists right now. We can't be face to face for long periods of time, and you know, we have limited movement, so we can't really be in galleries. We can't be interacting like in art school. We are taught to go see and interact with other artists, go visit their exhibits, go visit them in their studios, you know, work in communes so that you can really thrive and feed off of each other's energy. And artists and musicians just aren't doing that right now. But one thing that they are doing is taking advantage of the technology that Camille mentioned. There's technology out there in social media that's really assisting our artists right now. And that's not really new. I mean, if everyone remembers MySpace was actually, you know, 2007, 8, that was created as an online platform for musicians to share music. And so artists using social media is not really new. And it's really fortunate that we have artists on Instagram sharing images, artists on Twitter, you know, sharing news about exhibits and other things going on. Facebook has been a great way for artists to connect and form groups, and for musicians to share music and to perform to online audiences. So the technology really is there to help artists right now deal with this isolation that they're facing. And I even have used artists or used technology as a consumer of art. I viewed the Resilience, Reflection, and Rebuilding exhibit online. I don't leave the house that much because of the pandemic. So I was fortunate, you know, that it was an online exhibit. And when you Google, you know, pandemic inspired art, you'll see lots of other artists sharing art online and using that platform. There's a couple interesting art exhibits that I've found online and really enjoyed. The Washington Post in July put out a call and asked their readers to share their artwork. So they received like 650 submissions, and they've put that online. And then the Getty Museum, if anyone's seen it, has this really interesting initiative where they ask people to recreate iconic artworks through tableau vivant, so through reenactment. So if you search the hashtag Getty Challenge or hashtag between art and quarantine, and don't do it now because I know everyone's going to grab their phones now and stop listening to me and look at it, you'll see these really, they're humorous, but people put a lot of time into recreating paintings by like Frida Kahlo and Modigliani and Grant Wood. But it's just been a really great way that, as you know, museums were closed and galleries weren't having shows, people still found a way to appreciate and interact with art. And musicians are doing the same thing. On Facebook, there's a Facebook group called KC Online Live Music Series. So you can hear some music and see some performances by local musicians. And then there's a group called Arson Spitfire, which is an spoken word group that has open mic nights on Zoom. So there's still ways that our artists are using the technology. And so when you look at the art that's going on, that's being created, you're seeing these kind of similar themes of like isolation and photographs of empty streets and people taking pictures, you know, selfies or painting portraits of people that are alone and by themselves in their homes. And it really reminds you of those Edward Hopper paintings like Nighthawks and the Cape Cod Morning, that image of the woman staring out the window to the outside world, where she's just really isolating herself from what's going on outside, because that is our reality. And that's how artists today are creating those kinds of images right now, because that's how they're responding to this reality. And then also, as artists are isolated and working at home, they're doing a lot of introspection. And so they're really examining their feelings, how this moment in time is affecting them. Some are being more experimental and seeing changes in the materials that they're using, the subject matters. We're seeing themes of hopefulness and contrasted with some even dark themes because again, our artists are looking forward to a brighter future, but also recognizing that we're living in some really, really dark times. But then one thing that I am seeing in the art that's being produced is how artists are using their mediums as a way to cope with these difficult times. And really understanding that there's a power in art in helping the individual deal with trauma and anxiety and stress and this kind of pervasive uncertainty that everyone is living in. And then of course, another theme that's coming out in our art is street art. And we can't ignore all the street art that has come out because of the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement. And so there's themes that are coming out of the street art too. And one of the themes that I've seen a lot are tributes to our frontline workers. And there's the image of the super nurse that was created by the street artist Fake, and it appeared in Amsterdam and it was shared all over social media as nurses and frontline workers as our new superheroes. And then there's also street art that's sending out messages of togetherness and unity within communities, you know, stay safe, stay home, wear your mask, you know, we're in this together. And then of course I mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement and all of the street art that's coming from that. And all of the memorial portraits of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor that are ubiquitous in cities around the world right now, not just in Minneapolis and not just in Kentucky or in the US, but around the world, that those portraits can be seen because of just the importance of the issues that their murders have brought. And so you see a lot of this street art that's popping up everywhere, and artists are taking advantage of that, of being able to put their artwork out there. In cities where we had some of the biggest protests this summer, and businesses boarded up their businesses, their windows. A lot of street artists saw that as blank canvas, and they started painting on it, and news media was covering it. And all these images were being shared of artwork created by Black artists, artists of color, women artists. And these have historically been groups and communities of artists that have been kind of left out of the mainstream, museum and gallery spaces, who now have this worldwide audience because of the media and social media being able to share their message. And then we can't, of course, not mention the Black Lives Matter murals that have all gone up. And what's interesting about those is how those have been sanctioned by governments, by local communities. Street art used to be thought of as, someone came up in the middle of the night, put something out there in the dark, and then it appeared, you just saw it. And it was part of the community, and it sent messages to the community. Street art is now global, and global messages are being shared. And so the Black Lives Matter mural in Washington, D.C. was supported by the mayor. And of course, we had the 6 murals in Kansas City that were supported by the 6 artists and the city of Kansas City and all these other organizations. So when you think about, what are the movements that are happening right now, of course, you can think street art and kind of elevating that art form to be considered, really an art form that is legitimate. And also thinking about who are the artists creating street art, whose voices are those that are coming through the street art. And it's a great way to center those Black and brown voices in our society as well as in art history. And then also we have to think about this movement of where art is. We've talked about street art being found on the street, art being shared on social media and online. So, are we now at a time and at a movement where the conventional means of viewing art in galleries or museums is changing? And then finally, I would just, mention even art as a coping mechanism now, and a movement where artists are using art and creating art, not just to respond to the terrible things that are going on, but to deal with the terrible things that are going on as a form of self-care.
Absolutely. I think all this speaks to the change that's taking place right now. I think that's what this comes down to, which is going to give me a great opportunity to introduce Smitha, who introduced herself earlier, but I do want to acknowledge that Smitha is one of the artists in our current exhibition, and she was actually our People's Choice Award with over 600 votes cast for her piece. And she won an honorarium from the Johnson County Museum Foundation, and her piece, The Impulse, will now be part of the permanent collection through the Johnson County Museum's Collecting COVID-19 initiative. So thank you to Smitha for not only participating in that, but then agreeing to have your piece selected in that way. So Smitha, are you creating in isolation right now? And if not, or if you are, how are you in contact with other artists in your community?
Oh, well, before that, let me just say a huge thank you and a round of applause to all the team members who worked for this wonderful show. I don't think so. If COVID was not there, I don't think so this show would have ever come up. So I think the whole team needs one round of applause. Like, they had done a fantastic job with this. And getting this award is, it's an honor. It's an honor. And I really I'm really glad I was part of it. But connecting to Arzie, what she mentioned is street art. I love the way the artworks are coming out on street. Like really, I mean, it's like something which we can all resonate to, like if you drive through or if you're walking through the artwork, we can see it. I think street art was once considered as kind of vandalism, you know, and it's really nice to see like how this has revolved, like it is now appreciated by everyone. But coming to the question of like, are you creating in isolation? Yes, most of the time. But it's just not me, but many of us are or were, like throughout this pandemic, in some form of that isolation when the whole world was like shut down, irrespective of what field they are in. Like, be it any field, like my husband is in IT and he was also working from home throughout. So it was kind of an isolation for everyone, or many of us. But having said that, many of the famous artworks created by famous artists were created during isolation. For example, The Scream, and I'm sure everyone has seen that. Like The Scream by Edward Munch in 1893. That speaks a lot. Like if you look at the history of it, it speaks a lot, like how he created that artwork. And I think it is typical for an artist to work in solitude or isolation. Whether you are painting from a photograph or a piece of landscape, because it gives them the space to process their thoughts, to research, and to play around with their crafts. So like, for example, when I'm creating something, I like to be away from any kind of distraction. So I literally shut down myself from everything so that I can concentrate on my painting and I submerge myself into it. So does that keep me away from the artist community? No. Once the artwork is finished, artists always love to talk about their work through different media. It can be through exhibitions or like putting up shows. Now, like Arzie said, we don't have those kind of options at this moment. Because of the pandemic, it has cut off many things. But thanks to the information technology and internet, I think I am able to put out my work to a larger audience through social media, be it Instagram, be it Facebook. And also it gives me an opportunity, because I have that time, it gives me an opportunity to know about other artists and their work. So yes, we cannot socialize like before, but it has opened up lots of other opportunities, like in-person meetings are now replaced with Zoom meetings. So yes, I am isolated, yet connected to the world because of these facilities. And I must say, organizations like, from Kansas City area I'm talking about, organizations like Arts KC, Kansas City Artists Coalition. These are one of the interurban Arts Council of Johnson County and Johnson County Museum, to name a few, are doing an incredible work to develop and keeping artist community connected and carry on us forward so that we all, when all this is cleared up, we are prepared to restart it again.
Absolutely. And thank you for those acknowledgements of all the services in our community. It's so important right now. I can't emphasize that enough. So Smitha, can you describe the work that you submitted for us and what influenced your artwork?
Yeah, absolutely. So as an artist, I always like to go through historical artworks. the main characteristic of these paintings will be, you will find a story of from that era or from that generation or from that year. So a few months back, I was Googling for a painting which was done during this era. But I stumbled upon a painting, and I'm sure many of you have seen that painting. It is called as the Four Horsemen. It has 4 horses on it, and it says, like, it depicts different things in it. One of the horse, say, is represented as famine. The other is represented as plague. I think one of them is war, and the 4th one is, I think, death. So, so I think it was during the start of 2020 when slowly the world was moving onto this invisible danger, and the news of a virus was spreading across the world. Though many of us never took that seriously at that time. The impact, that includes me too. So the impact of it, we started feeling by the 2nd month of 2020. That's when I knew, as an artist, I have to document this. I wanted to tell the story of this time. So I started with small illustrations, and those small illustrations was not covering like the larger impact of it, of this historical year. So I started with more research on news from across the world, because this is something the entire world was facing. And we all became part of it, irrespective of region or race. It didn't matter. Converting all those news into visual artworks, it was challenging because of the limited space. I think that is when I heard about the call from Johnson County Museum, and the 3 words really strike me: resilience, reflection, and rebuild. And that is what influenced me, I think I should say. Keeping this theme in my mind, I gathered all my illustrations and started combining all these small puzzle pieces which I was not able to connect to. And I turned it into a composition, to a larger canvas. So one of the main objective was dedicating it to the frontline workers, or else like the healthcare, the postal department, the teachers, or as a matter of fact, communities who looked out for each other, which we all considered like we never appreciated it before 2020. They all were part of it once this pandemic hit us. So the main phase reflects each one of those who tirelessly came together. The abstract in the background represents the state of mind in which we all are in, or we are in. Instead of using gloomy colors, I used bright colors to lift the spirit of the viewers. The painting is also about resilience and hope that we will come out of this one day and the world will be back to normal. There it is. Thank you for sharing it.
So just so everybody knows who is tuning in, this is the piece that has been selected to join the Johnson County Museum, which Smitha is describing right now.
So if you see, there are small images of it where these images are from different parts of the world. Like on the top right corner, you will see communities that have come together as part of donations and everything. The second image is like something when the schools were shut down, like kids were literally at home, like they couldn't step out or they were not able to do anything. So they found different means to get entertained, like art is one of them. So that is one of the picture, which is on the right-hand corner. And there are so many other images. The third image is, I should bring it out because there was a time when we couldn't even, touch each other. Like we couldn't hug each other. Parents couldn't hug their grandparents, or children couldn't hug their grandparents. But this is one of the image which really struck me, and I thought I had to put this in this artwork. On all the bright colors, it's just, I wanted the viewer to see, like, there is still hope. There is still love in between us. So let's focus on the positivity, and we will definitely come out of it.
Absolutely. And for some perspective, Smitha, can you remind us, this is a large piece. Do you know off the top of your head the measurements?
I think it's a 2-canvas painting. So as I mentioned before, for me, the space I felt, because the topic is so vast that I couldn't fit it in one canvas. So I had to pick 2 canvas. I think one of the canvas is 30 by 40. So let's just multiply it so that becomes the dimension of it there.
Absolutely. And it's beautiful. I can't emphasize that enough. So we've got about 10 minutes left. I'm going to address one more question, and then we do have one Q&A question that we will address. But I would like to know from everybody here, and I'll kind of direct who can respond first, but are we at a tipping point in society? What might a post-apocalyptic era with everything happening right now, what permanent changes maybe be looking at in the future? Craig, can we start with you?
Certainly. Well, I think to your first point, I certainly hope we're at a tipping point. And by that, I mean, I hope we, and I certainly don't just mean as Americans. I hope we as human beings take this to heart and actually learn something as far as a, sort of a didactic moment where we find ourselves saying, okay, X and Y and Z things we used to do are no longer feasible, whatever that may take. To me, that's, at this point, I think that's still unknowable. But I certainly look at my 8 and 10-year-old boys, and it's kind of hard to talk about sometimes. I believe they're tougher than me, but this new normal for them, which is what I hope will end up being something in the long run far more positive. But I look at it this way: I hope that the tipping point, I mean that in the ameliorative. In other words, I mean it in a really positive way, is what my hope is. And as far as the post-apocalyptic, depending on what you all have read or what you're familiar with, I think about the 1985 book, The Postman by David Brin. Before they made an okay film, the best part about the film was Tom Petty was in it, which was great. But I think about the last really set of scenes that shows that after the apocalypse, and that's really that new normal, when after the nuclear war, when things have started to come back and things end up being quite a bit better than they were during the point at which the Postman and all his cohort were sort of fighting for their lives and trying to reestablish some sort of structure to things after the social systems and the social contract collapsed. That's my hope. I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely. And I want to give everyone a chance to kind of address that, but our Q&A question is relevant to that question. So I want to make sure that I address that within our time frame here. Asking all of you, do you think that society's response to an apocalypse is more positive or negative? And why might that be? And just thinking about the ways we've addressed these questions here, we have definitely gone to both ends of the spectrum as far as, are these changes a good thing or a bad thing? Camille, would you have any input on that?
I think positively, and I think we can see this through the everyday movements of our own lives, and part of that shifting of our thinking of what we used to be able to do, which we're not, and which we are again. I was just thinking earlier, Smitha what you're saying of not being able, like physical touch, for example, and as we've learned more information about what's safe and what isn't, and what we need to do to stem the pandemic, that's created those pockets, those moments of hope, certainly. And I certainly think, at least for myself, there's that building of that self-awareness of what we choose to do every day, and how impactful that can be for our own lives, for our communities, for the larger ones. And certainly this was always true. But like in the ways with World War I, you know, these inequities, for example, racially, perfect example, many times our panelists have brought up the Black Lives Matter movement, which those equities are always there, but sometimes we have this moment, this fracturing, this springboard for that moves forward some of that work that is years and years and years in the making. So certainly the hope to come from this time too, that people have gained more of that awareness, and some of potentially progress that has been made during this time, that how do we bring this forward, and how do we do this in a time when it is safer to be out, when we can be immersed physically within our communities too.
Absolutely, thank you. And Arzie, do you have some input as far as, are we at a tipping point, and is this positive or negative, just to kind of wrap that up?
You know, when I saw this question, I found it really timely in the way I'm going to answer it. I found it very triggering. And triggering because of the question about societal change, and really thinking about what is going on in our society now, especially, and I can't ignore it, what happened on January 6th and the insurrection at the Capitol. And seeing those images, because this is, you know, we're responding to what is happening now, and questioning, are we in an apocalypse, and is this a tipping point? You know, seeing those images and those videos on that day really just gives us more evidence of privilege in this country, and what it means to be white and what it means to be male. And the violent actions that happened on that day, as a person of color, as a person who is an immigrant also, just puts an exclamation point on a year, 2020, when we saw a country that was just becoming more and more and more and more divided, and how unfairly Black and brown and indigenous and immigrant people were treated. And not just, you know, people in those communities who were out marching and, you know, protesting themselves, but just the treatment of these people in these communities going about their daily lives. So it's, you know, are we at a tipping point? You know, how do we really answer that when it's, you know, I feel like the shock and anger and fear and sadness that January 6th caused in all of us has been experienced before. And, you know, should we have been at a tipping point when the US hit 300,000 dead people from COVID-19? You know, should we have been at a tipping point when George Floyd was murdered because someone was standing on his neck? And shouldn't have been a tipping point when we had millions of people marching in reaction to that around the world? And even before that, shouldn't we have been at a tipping point when in 1991, Rodney King was beat in the middle of the street by police, and we had 5 days of riots in LA afterwards? So, you know, like Craig said, I hope that what happened on January 6th is the tipping point. And it's really, you can't ignore that, you know, that time it was different. You know, the siege was on our nation's capital. It was our elite lawmakers whose lives were in danger, and they were all white. So is that really what it takes to bring societal change? So I think if this is the tipping point, what comes next has to be positive. And that's the only way I can answer that.
Absolutely. Would anyone like to follow that up? Thank you, Arzie, very much for sharing that so eloquently and so passionately. I think that these conversations are vital to how this moves forward. And I think that that is why this has to be addressed. It needs to be talked about. It needs to be approached by artists and writers and musicians and whoever it may be, so that those tools can be used to communicate this to everyone, so that everyone can find a way to hopefully positively move forward from recent events and long-term events and such. So I want to once again express my sincerest thank you to each and every one of you for participating in this. We are at time, so I am going to go ahead and wrap things up. Thank you to all of you for taking the time to have these conversations with us surrounding, are we in an apocalypse now? I don't know whether we have an answer or not. And I think that that's one of the beautiful things about this conversation. I do want to thank also all of our audience members for participating in this conversation. And I encourage you to continue to have these conversations, find ways to continue to connect on this discussion point, and reach out to artists, support artists. That's important. And I want to thank our partners, the Johnson County Museum, the Fine Arts Department of Johnson County Park and Recreation District, and the Arts Council of Johnson County for this wonderful program and exhibition that has taken place. Again, it's up through January 22nd, so I encourage you to view it when possible. And again, thank you to Humanities Kansas for their generous support of tonight's event. And lastly, we will be sending out a survey to our attendees so that we can get some feedback and learn how we can continue to have these conversations in the best ways possible. So thank you all.